Hello, welcome to another video of Edexcel A-Level English, where we'll be doing the picture of Dorian Gray, and I'll be covering context and a few quotes and a tiny bit of analysis in this video. If you haven't seen my other video, which is The Little Stranger by Sarah Waters, make sure to go check that out, because that is the text that my school compares both of these to. Oscar Wilde was born in Dublin. His parents were known for their extravagant lifestyles. He was the early figure of a celebrity, fashionable and famous for being famous. And this is much like Dorian himself. He's a big figure in society because of his wealth, and his parents were also wealthy. However, his father was from the working class. In 1884, he married Constance Lloyd and had two sons, Cyril and Vivian. 2 years later, he was sentenced to hard labour for his homosexuality, and he also went to prison. This is because he was caught having an affair with this 17-year-old boy. However, him and his wife never divorced. Wilde was released in 1897 and moved to Paris, where he stayed until death. He died of meningitis in 1900. He typically wrote plays and short stories, but Dorian Gray was his only novel. He wrote the play The Importance of Being Earnest, which you've probably heard of. He died, 46th of November 30th, 1900 of meningitis. The aesthetic movement, or art for art's sake, permeated British culture during the 19th century. It was based on the idea that beauty was the most important element of life. So artists wanted to create something that was admired only for its beauty, divorced from any moral or narrative content. They believed that art shouldn't have any meaning behind it, it should just be created purely for beauty. And this is seen where where Basil is saying to Henry, who is a key believer in the aesthetic movement, that he doesn't want to exhibit his painting because it shows his true feelings for Dorian in it, for one, which would have been forbidden as homosexuality was against the law. And also, he believed that art should just be art, it shouldn't have those deeper meanings and metaphors within it. The movement blossomed into a cult that was devoted to the creation of beauty and embracing a new simplicity of life. Oscar Wilde dominated aesthetic literature. For visual art, simple portraits of beautiful women that are pleasing to the eye were most popular, rather than a painting related to a literary story. And that links to Dorian, a simply beautiful man. Basil doesn't like Dorian for his brains, his intelligence, his personality, but simply just for his aesthetics. It's a very it's a very shallow love for Dorian. The aesthetic movement challenged the Victorian public in an era where art was supposed to tell a story, and without it, it was still considered a work of art, was a radical idea. The ideas of the aesthetic movement was an important stepping stone in the road towards modern art. There was a lot of controversy about whether art should have meaning during this time, and Oscar Wilde was a very big figure for the art for art's sakes movement. So there was a lot of controversy surrounding him as a person and also what he and a few other people believed in. Similarly, in America, Edgar Allan Poe also was a champion for the aesthetic movement, and he's actually mentioned in A Streetcar Named Desire if you've read that play. The decadent era acts as a transition between Romanticism and the nascent experience of modernism. And Romanticism was a movement in the arts and literature that originated also in the late 18th century, emphasizing inspiration, subjectivity, and the primacy of the individual. And that's where artists used current social issues portrayed in their work. Wilde expresses his contempt for prevailing values and sensibilities and asserts his sense of superiority and the amorality of art. This aggressive stance towards society conveys the artist's alienation. And he is ultimately made an outsider and, alienated from society because of his homosexuality. And this is similar to when Basil conveys his feelings for Dorian within the portrait. If society considers sexual relations, even between the husband and wife, a private matter bordering on a taboo, the decadent may devote a poem to a graphic, intimate description of a night with a prostitute. The attack itself serves to underscore the force and dominance of mainstream morality, if not to concede its validity. So this basically means that it was used to criticize lots of social issues. For example, sexuality in society was extremely taboo. So it was used to sort of undermine this. And also it was to show that there's no harm towards these social problems, that they're really not as big as they seem. The paradox or self-contradiction plays through perhaps the greatest English expression of decadent thought and art is through the picture of Dorian Gray, especially in chapter 11, where we just get a whole chapter of Dorian exploring decadent and aesthetic ideas, doing some self-indulgence, exploring, different cultures, objects like perfumes and music and things like that. Part of the freedom of the mood in the fin de siècle resulted in the idea of the new woman. This defined the rich and educated woman who was becoming more confident. A range of women writers began to publish despite still prevalent sexism. And you should know the term the new woman if you have read Dracula, for example. Mina Harker, she's a perfect embodiment of the new woman, which was slowly coming into society, but still surrounding a bit of anxiety and concern about the explicit sexuality of women. It was feared and it was still taboo. Wilde's female characters are full of energy and creativity. For example, Lady Narborough is much cleverer than her husband, and it's the female characters who drive forward the conversation. Similarly, the Duchess of Monmouth, Gladys, married to a dull husband of 60, who collects beetles, is seen flirting with both Lord Henry and Dorian. She is sexually confident, but also she herself is in danger of being ousted by society as a fallen woman. For example, it's said in the book that courage has passed from men to women. And also, Henry describes the Duchess of Monmouth as she's very clever, too clever for a woman. She lacks the indefiable charm of weakness. It's the feet of clay that make the gold of the image precious, showing how her intelligence undermines the stereotypical femininity of women and all their characteristics, yet he doesn't see this as a bad thing. Fin de siècle, the phrase is simply French for end of the century, but it carries a weight of connotations about a state of mind, like wariness, cynicism, and supposedly light morals or standards. It was linked to a sense of foreboding, as when Dorian puns on the phrase warily, saying he feels it is fin de globe, or the end of the world. The phrase and the sensibility associated with it were beginning to enter the popular consciousness around the 1890s as commentators tried to make connections between different types of artists. And this is quite like Lord Henry, as he is very cynical himself. This was the period when a new mood came over the intelligentsia of Britain. After decades under Queen Victoria, there was a sense that a new age was being ushered in, of increased sexual freedom. This obviously links back to the new woman, greater scientific inquiry, and abandonment of fixed certainties. And this is the idea of secularization kind of began in this era, and the questioning of Christianity as a meta-narrative, came around this time, and science was seen as the certainty, as religion just couldn't provide the same comforts that it did before. This was linked to the decadence and the idea that one didn't have to adhere to the determined optimism of the Romantic movement or the moral guidelines of philosophers and art critics like Ruskin. The ideas and writings of three giants in the 19th century, Freud, Darwin, and Marx, were beginning to filter down into society. Wilde wrote in an essay that the 19th century is a turning point in history, and he named Darwin as one of the main influences. We know Wilde was influenced by the still famous Gothic novel by Robert Louis Stevenson, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, written just 4 years before in 1886. Both novels take place in the modern city, a new departure for the Gothic novel. Both novels contrast the slums of London with the houses of the wealthy that conceal secrets behind their front doors. For example, when Dorian visits the opium dens, this exposes the material deprivation that was in the really low classes that they lived in and where they took their drugs recreationally. However, Dorian's house that he lives in does show his grandeur and his genteel qualities and his old money. We're told that Jekyll feels a leap of welcome as his alter ego, the evil Hyde, takes him over. This was the time when the father of modern criminology, the Italian scientist Lombroso, spread his ideas. He believed essentially that criminality was inherited and that criminals could be identified by physical attributes such as hawk-like noses and bloodshot eyes. Although this was obviously a flawed concept, he was one of the first people in history to use scientific methods to study crime, and the implications of some of his ideas caught the imagination of writers like Wilde and Stevenson. So, for example, Dorian sees that this immoral thing has taken over this spirit, this supernatural element. And similar to Freud, if you do psychology, you'll know the tripartite theory of the personality, where the id, which is the pleasure principle, has basically taken over Dorian's mind if you're taking a psychodynamic approach to reading this novel. Due to Freud, the discipline of psychology was developing, and Victorians began to realize that personality consisted of multiple egos and not just one, which is the id, the ego, and the superego. The ego is the the superego is the morality principle. The id is obviously the pleasure principle, and the superego just mediates between the two, and it makes choices. Jekyll calls this a mere polity of multifarious, incongruous, and independent densians. This is important in understanding the character of Dorian, as this character is a classic example of Gothic duality. The main aspect of the Gothic double is that it can never be destroyed or conquered. At some point it will have to be confronted. Dorian's great mistake is to think that he can destroy his double without any consequences on himself, seen in the final chapter where he decides to very symbolically stab the painting which he used to stab Basil, which ultimately destroys himself. However, this isn't a humble sacrifice. He has no idea that this will lead to his own demise. So, as a reader, we don't get really any justice in him dying. He is destroyed. However, it wasn't his intention. He hasn't repented for his sins. So here are some quotes for the supernatural and Gothic setting and decline. So, if it were I who was to always be young and the picture that was to grow old, I would give my soul for. This is the essential line that starts the whole debacle of Dorian being taken over by something else. His vanity about his youth ends up corrupting him. His envy for immortality that just can't be obtained. The only way to get rid of a temptation is to yield it, resist it, and your soul grows sick with longing for things it has forbidden to itself, desire for what its monstrous laws have made monstrous and unlawful. The expression looked different. One would have said there was a touch of cruelty in the mouth. It was certainly strange. He uttered a mad wish. The portrait would be to him the most magical of mirrors. In the portrait we can see, over time, how his actions are so ugly. Whilst his youth remains, his actions affect the picture. Now, someone who wasn't so vain and obsessed with their image maybe could have used this to better themselves and use it for self-reflection. Yet Dorian is just corrupted by Lord Henry's hedonist ideas. There were moments when he looked on evil simply as a mode through which he could realize his conception of the beautiful. It had brought melancholy across his passions. Its mere memory had marred many moments of joy. It had been like conscience to him. Yes, it had been like conscience. He would destroy it. He doesn't want to pay for any of the sins that he has done throughout the spell that's been cast on him. He has no sympathy for any people he's made victim. For a moment he thought of praying that the horrible sympathy that existed between him and his picture might cease. He would examine with minute-cure, and sometimes with a monstrous and terrible delight, the hideous lines that seared the wrinkling forehead or crawled around the heavy, sensual mouth. He finds it humorous that he doesn't have to pay the prices physically for his corrupt mind, for his immoral choices. He rushed at him and dug the knife into the great vein that is behind the ear, crushing the man's head down on the table, stabbing again and again. This brute, violent force that he uses against someone that cares about him, someone that was confronting him to make sure he was okay against him, just shows how cruel Dorian becomes. What What was that loathsome red dew that gleamed, wet and glistening on one of the hands as though the canvas had sweated blood? How horrible it was! He had sought to kill, had all the bloom of his boyhood, all the unstained purity of youth. And interestingly, he kills Basil in his own playroom. And it's kind of alluded to that Dorian experiences a lot of rough, maybe traumatizing things in his childhood. And it's kind of the Freudian idea that trauma in childhood leads to later trauma in life, but, maybe committing of crime or affection of psychopathy. Then he loathed his own beauty, and flinging the mirror on the floor, crushed it into silver splinters beneath his head. So, in Basil's studio, this is in the very first chapter, the rich odour of roses, the light summer wind, heavy scent of lilac, or the more delicate perfume of the pink flowering thorn. This is an excellent description of aestheticism, of people like Basil taking great pride in having very materialistic items. It's very heavy in imagery. In Henry's library, reclining in a luxurious armchair, the little library in Mayfair, high-panelled wainscoting of olive-stained oak, ceilings of raised plasterwood, silk long-fringed Persian rugs. On a tiny satin-wood table stood a statuette by a Cloydian, gilt daisies, large blue china jars, and parrot tulips, apricot-coloured light of a summer day in London. These are all very expensive items, and especially the Persian rug. During this time, people weren't going on excursions and vacations. Only the very, very wealthy could afford to venture out to other countries and source objects from different cultures. So this really goes to show Henry's wealth and his indulgence. The dim roar of London was like the bourdon note of a distant organ. I think an organ definitely alludes to funerals and signifies all of the deaths that Dorian causes. Again, Persian saddlebags just self-indulgence and old money. Drunkards reeled by cursing and chattering to themselves like monstrous apes. This is where Dorian is at the opium dens. He surrounds himself with the lower class. He wants to lull his moral sense to sleep. I don't remember if that might be a quote in the actual thing, or it might be a critic quote, but he is trying to get away from any sort of guilt feelings by, surrounding himself with people of the lower class. He's escaping his facade of wealth and purity and making himself impure by injecting things into his body. He had seen grotesque children huddled up on the doorsteps and heard shrieks and oaths from gloomy courts. This just adds to the anxiety. It just shows that Dorian is not meant to be in this place. Tremulous branches, unable to bear the burden of their flame-like beauty. The room looked as if it had not been lived in for years. The whole place was covered with dust, and that the carpet was in holes. A mouse ran scuffling behind the wainscoting. This is about the playroom, and it shows that Dorian couldn't reach his trauma. He didn't want to address it. So he's locked up. He's put all of his memories into this room and just locked them up and hasn't addressed them. And maybe this could be another factor in his downfall, as well as the picture. It could suggest why he's so easily swayed by Henry, someone who's he's almost like a father figure, giving advice and insight into life, which Dorian wasn't able to experience in his childhood. Street lamps look ghastly in the dripping mist. Seagulls' screams, fantastic shadows. The moon hung low in the sky like a yellow skull. Here we can see the motif of death and the motif of disease. I'm not going to do every quote because otherwise we'll be sit here for years, but feel free to pause and just read them and look at them and maybe annotate them as well because these are some quite key quotes. But I feel like the love section is very important. I want the dead lovers of the world to hear our laughter. My God, Harry, how I worship her. Here he puts Sybil on a pedestal of gold, lifting her up out of her working class and making her this goddess figure. Even though he causes her fall from grace, he ultimately just leaves her to rot and leaves her to die with no guilt for his actions whatsoever because he goes to the opera house that evening. So the stark contrast between these two quotes is, very dramatic. To be in love is to surpass oneself, and this is Sybil says that. I wish I had for as sure as there is a God in heaven. If he ever does you any wrong, I shall kill him. This is what James says. And, it kind of foreshadows, but not. Somehow, justice is half obtained in the end. However, it's quite a sad spin of events because James ends up being the one to die. And it shows how in this period, the upper classes always triumphed the working classes. I love Sybil Vane. I want to place her on a pedestal of gold. Again, just wanting to shower her in money and his love and then just taking it all away from her, and she's only a child. You've killed my love. You used to stir my imagination. Now you don't even stir my curiosity. You simply produce no effect. You have thrown it all away. You are shallow and stupid. However, Dorian was never really properly in love with Sybil. Although his actions suggest so, you could argue that he was only in love with the character she played, not the real Sybil. And it's shown how that they're not deeply connected, as she calls him Prince Charming. Sybil doesn't even know Dorian's real name. This is also reminiscent of how people of the upper class would use um pseudonyms, like fake names, to hang out in the more low places of society. Make her amends, marry her, try to love her again. It was his duty to do so. He wrote a passionate letter imploring her forgiveness. But it was already too late. You can't take back those words that have already scarred her. A strange sense of loss came over him. He repeated her name over and over again. Here we actually do see an ounce of guilt from Dorian. However, he goes on to say she had no right to kill herself, it was selfish of her. An hour later, he was at the opera. This guilt is very quickly whisked away by Lord Henry and his self-indulgent and very selfish ideas. It goes to show that Lord Henry is Dorian's id and Basil acts as Dorian's superego. Henry, romantic olive-coloured face and worn expression, cool white flower-like hands. This is a very big contrast to some of his dark beliefs. He's so cynical, and this really contrasts his appearance. All influence is immoral. However, he influences Dorian to the point where Dorian is beyond redemption. But this is down to personal choice and Dorian's own free will. He chooses to commit these atrocities. To gain a reputation, this just shows the importance of reputation in society at the time. I can't help detesting my relations. He's just very cynical. He doesn't allow people to get close to him. He purposefully isolates himself. You never say a moral thing, and you never do a wrong thing. Your cynicism is simply a pose. This is something that Basil says to Henry, because Basil can't fathom that Henry has, no love, no light, no life in his life. His heavy opium-tainted cigarette. There is no such thing as bad influence. This is dramatically contrasted throughout the entire novel. Youth is the only one thing worth having. Here he's poisoning Dorian's mind, something he wasn't even insecure of until Henry mentioned it. A wonderful ending to a wonderful play. This is where he is talking about Sybil Vane's death, saying that her death is a wonderful ending to a play. Sybil is a real person with real feelings, and Henry undermines all of this. Because of her class, and because she is a woman, he doesn't care about her feelings. The girl never really lived, so she never really died. Don't waste your tears over Sybil Vane. He criticizes Dorian for feeling emotions, for allowing himself to, experience bereavement and the feeling of loss and guilt because it was at his own fault. What does it profit a man if he gain the whole world and lose? Nothing can cure the soul but the senses, just as nothing can cure the senses but the soul. Dorian repeats this later on, and it goes to show how Henry drives his values into Dorian's mind. I can stand brute force, but brute reason is quite unbearable. The way of paradoxes is the way of truth. To get back one's youth, one merely has to repeat one's follies. I hope that Dorian Gray will make this woman his wife, passionately adore her for 6 months, and then suddenly become fascinated by someone else. He would be a wonderful study. When Henry explains that he's, hedonistic, cynical, and he prioritizes his own self-indulgence, he clearly means it. He doesn't he doesn't care for his own friends and he acts as a mentor to Dorian. He doesn't care about his health at all. If she knows as little about life as she does about acting, she will be a delightful experience. again, just criticizing the working class woman. My dear boy, no woman is a genius. Women are the decorative sex. They never have anything to say, but they say it charmingly. He has a wife, and it goes to show that he doesn't appreciate her at all. He wouldn't agree with the new woman, and he certainly would not be mystified by it. He here is ultimately rejecting the new woman and the idea that women are equal to men. This is quite long as well, so you can just read those and pause if you'd like. An artist should create beautiful things, but should put nothing of his own life into them. This is a very key aesthetic movement idea. Think of Dorian's birth and position and wealth. It would be absurd for him to marry so much beneath him. This definitely portrays the values and beliefs of society at the time. And this wouldn't be an absurd thing for Basil to say. This is very much every aristocratic man's views of marriage in society. This could be Wilde using Basil to criticize this idea as Sybil ultimately dies. The reason I will not exhibit his picture is that I'm afraid that I have shown in it the secret of my own soul, which is his homosexuality and his love, and that's very similar to Oscar Wilde. And I forgot to include this in the context, but originally, when this novel was posted, it was posted in chapters in, newspapers and magazine articles. And the original reading of it, it caused outrage. It literally caused an uproar because of the homosexual undertones, the elements of the Greek in it. So in the official published version, it had to be changed. And in the film version, there are no homosexual undertones unless you look very deeply. I knew that I had come face to face with someone whose mere personality was so fascinating that if I allowed it to do so, it would absorb my whole nature, my whole soul, my very art itself. He was going to fall in love with Dorian if he got to know him better, so he limited himself in just admiring his beauty. The world might guess it. This is representative of society reading the picture of Dorian Gray and passing judgments on Wilde, suggesting that he is homosexual. I couldn't be happy if I didn't see him. The personality of Dorian Gray will dominate me. He felt that Dorian Gray would never again be all to him that he had been in the past. Life had come between them. Their friendship ultimately takes a turn where Dorian prefers to spend time with Henry, a very influential and dominating figure, as opposed to Basil. And this is another part of his decline, as he chooses pleasure over morality. The dead thing still seated in the chair. This is when Basil has been stabbed by Dorian, the ultimate. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope it was helpful just to be shown the quotes and the context very briefly. Make sure you spend the first 15 minutes of paper 2 exam making a plan so that you compare this text with the other chosen comparative text. And I do go over the little stranger. Good luck on all of your exams and your revision, and thank you for watching.